Funny how quickly people forget whose name built the walls around them, Harrison said softly as Isabel lifted her wine glass and smiled across the long oak table like she already owned everything inside Blackthorn Estate. The chandelier light shimmered against crystal glasses and polished silver, while rain pressed gently against the tall dining room windows overlooking the dark Connecticut coastline. David sat rigid beside his wife, loosening his tie every few minutes as though the room itself had become too tight around his throat. Across from them, Victoria remained perfectly composed in her dark emerald silk dress, her cold blue eyes fixed on Harrison with the same quiet contempt she had carried for decades. Ethan noticed it immediately. He always noticed things the rest of the family ignored. "You know," Victoria said as James placed another platter at the center of the table, "some people spend their entire lives surviving off other families' generosity." Isabel smirked into her wine. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward her untouched plate. Nobody defended Harrison. Nobody ever did. Harrison simply leaned back in his chair at the far end of the massive oak table, denim jacket worn at the sleeves, silver hair slightly disheveled beneath the warm chandelier glow. He looked like an old mechanic who had wandered into the wrong dinner party by mistake. That was exactly how they preferred to see him. David cleared his throat nervously. "Mother, maybe tonight isn't the time." "No," Victoria replied calmly. "Tonight is exactly the time. Blackthorn Estate cannot continue carrying unnecessary weight." Ethan glanced toward Harrison again, waiting for anger, humiliation, anything at all. Instead, the old man reached slowly for his whiskey glass and turned it once between his fingers. The fire cracked softly inside the marble fireplace behind him. Isabel folded her napkin carefully. "The attorneys are coming Friday," she said. "Once the restructuring is finalized, this house can finally move forward." Thomas, the family lawyer, adjusted his glasses without speaking. But Ethan caught the brief flicker of tension in the older man's face the moment Harrison looked directly at him. It lasted less than a second. Still, it was enough. Harrison took a slow sip of whiskey before setting the glass down beside his plate. "Forward," he repeated quietly, almost amused. The grandfather clock echoed through the enormous dining room. Somewhere upstairs, an old pipe groaned inside the walls of the estate. Then Harrison smiled faintly, his tired eyes moving across every face seated beneath the chandelier. "You all seem very confident for people living inside my house." Nobody spoke after Harrison said it. The silence settled over the dining room like cold dust drifting through an abandoned church. Even the fire behind him seemed quieter somehow. Ethan looked around the table, expecting someone to laugh, to dismiss the comment as another strange remark from the old man everyone treated like furniture inside Blackthorn Estate. But nobody laughed. Victoria reached slowly for her wine glass without taking her eyes off Harrison. Thomas adjusted his cufflinks again, his fingers less steady now. Isabel was the first to recover. "That is an interesting sense of humor," she said lightly, though her smile no longer reached her eyes. Harrison nodded once as if he had not noticed the tension spreading across the room. Humor helps people survive uncomfortable truths. David exhaled heavily and stood from his chair. "I think everybody has had enough wine tonight." He loosened his tie again before walking toward the staircase near the foyer. Ethan watched his father disappear into the shadows of the enormous hallway lined with old family portraits. Every painting inside Blackthorn Estate carried the same expression: wealth, pride, distance, the kind of faces that looked down on people before learning their names. Harrison had lived among those walls for nearly 30 years, yet nobody ever included him in the photographs. Officially, he handled maintenance around the estate after Eleanor hired him decades earlier. He repaired leaking pipes, restored broken fireplaces, managed contractors, fixed storm damage along the eastern property line. Guests assumed he was an aging groundskeeper who stayed because Eleanor pitied him. Victoria encouraged that assumption every chance she got. Some people get too comfortable living off family generosity, she often said whenever Harrison entered the room. The strange thing was Harrison never defended himself, never corrected anyone, never explained why James treated him with more respect than most of the blood relatives seated at the table. Ethan noticed those details growing up. He noticed how James always asked Harrison before changing anything inside the estate. He noticed how contractors lowered their voices around him. Even Thomas, one of the most expensive estate attorneys in New England, spoke carefully whenever Harrison entered a room unexpectedly. Ethan used to think he imagined it. Tonight felt different. Tonight, the mask covering Blackthorn Estate had cracked just enough for everyone to glimpse something underneath. Eleanor suddenly stood from the table, her pastel cardigan trembling slightly beneath the chandelier light. "It is late," she said softly. "We should finish this conversation another time." Harrison watched her quietly for a moment. There was no anger in his expression. That frightened Ethan more than anger would have. The old man simply looked tired. Tired in the way people looked after carrying secrets too heavy for too many years. Then Harrison rose slowly from his chair, picked up his worn denim jacket from the backrest, and glanced once toward the towering staircase disappearing into darkness above the estate. "The house remembers everything," he said quietly before walking out of the dining room alone. Rain continued through most of the night, tapping softly against the tall windows of Blackthorn Estate, while Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling in the guest room at the end of the east wing. He could still hear Harrison's voice in his head. "You all seem very confident for people living inside my house." The words made no sense, yet somehow they explained everything at once. Ethan sat up just after 2 in the morning when he heard footsteps moving slowly through the hallway outside his room. He opened the door quietly and saw Eleanor standing alone beneath the dim wall sconces near the staircase. Her silver curls looked softer in the low light, but her face carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years pretending not to remember something important. "Grandma?" Ethan asked gently. She startled slightly before forcing a smile that disappeared almost immediately. "You should be asleep. Why is everyone afraid of Harrison?" The question lingered between them. Eleanor looked toward the dark hallway leading to the west wing of the estate, the oldest part of the mansion where most rooms remained locked year-round. "People fear the things they cannot control," she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. Who is he really? Eleanor pressed her hand against the polished banister as though steadying herself. For a moment Ethan thought she might answer. Instead, footsteps echoed from downstairs. David emerged from his office, still wearing his dress shirt, sleeves rolled unevenly to his elbows. He looked exhausted. "The bank is refusing another extension," he muttered under his breath, not noticing Ethan at first. "If Friday goes badly, we lose everything." Eleanor's expression tightened instantly. "Lower your voice." David laughed bitterly. "Why? Everybody already knows this family is bleeding money." Ethan had never heard his father speak that way before. David was always controlled, careful, polished like the rest of the Blackthorn image. Tonight, he looked like a man barely holding himself together. "Isabel thinks restructuring the estate will calm investors," David continued. "Mother thinks selling the shoreline property solves everything. Thomas keeps promising legal protection, but none of them are telling me the full truth." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Some truths arrived too late to fix. David finally noticed Ethan standing there. His jaw tightened immediately. "Go back to bed." But Ethan did not move. Does Harrison own this house? The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. David looked toward Eleanor, waiting for her to deny it. She said nothing. Somewhere downstairs, an old grandfather clock echoed through the mansion again. Ethan suddenly remembered something from childhood. Every Christmas morning, before opening gifts, James always handed Harrison the first cup of coffee in the house. At the time it seemed harmless. Respectful, maybe. Now it felt different. Like an old ritual everybody followed without explaining why. David rubbed both hands over his face. "You are too young to understand this family." Ethan stared toward the dark west wing hallway where faint light glowed beneath a closed door. "No," he said quietly. "I think I am finally starting to." The next morning arrived gray and cold over the Connecticut shoreline, the kind of weather that made Blackthorn Estate feel less like a home and more like an aging monument waiting for something inevitable to happen inside its walls. Ethan found James already awake in the main kitchen before sunrise, polishing silver trays beneath the warm yellow glow of hanging copper lights. The smell of black coffee and old cedar drifted softly through the enormous room. James glanced up briefly when Ethan entered. "You are up early." Ethan poured himself coffee and leaned against the marble counter. "Could not sleep." James nodded as though he expected that answer. Outside the kitchen windows, fog rolled slowly across the eastern gardens where dead winter roses still clung stubbornly to their vines. "James," Ethan said carefully. How long has Harrison lived here? The older man continued polishing the silver in silence for several seconds before answering. Longer than most people remember. Was he always just maintenance staff? That finally made James stop moving. He set the silver tray down with unusual care before looking directly at Ethan for the first time that morning. In houses like this, young man, titles are often designed to hide the truth rather than reveal it. Ethan felt his stomach tighten slightly. Before he could ask another question, Isabel entered the kitchen wearing a cream cashmere sweater and dark slacks, perfectly composed despite the tension from the night before. There you are, she said toward Ethan with polite brightness that sounded practiced rather than genuine. Your father wants everyone in the library at 10. James quietly returned to polishing silver while Isabel prepared tea near the stove. Ethan noticed she checked her phone repeatedly, her calm exterior slipping each time another message appeared. Bad morning? Ethan asked casually. Isabel forced a small smile. Investors become nervous when families appear unstable. And are we unstable? Isabel looked toward the fogged kitchen windows before answering. Families like ours survive because appearances matter more than emotions. Ethan remembered Harrison sitting alone at the end of the dining table while everyone treated him like a burden attached to the estate. Yet somehow nobody ever asked him to leave. Nobody truly challenged him either. Isabel stirred her tea slowly. Your grandfather built this family's reputation over 50 years, she said quietly. One scandal can destroy all of it. What scandal? Isabel's spoon stopped moving. You asked too many questions lately. Ethan watched her carefully. For the first time, he noticed exhaustion underneath her elegant appearance. Not guilt exactly. Fear. The kind people carried when something carefully hidden started moving too close to daylight. Upstairs, somewhere deep inside the West Wing, a door opened heavily. Both Ethan and Isabel looked upward instinctively. Footsteps moved slowly across the old hardwood floors above them. James lowered his eyes immediately and straightened his posture without being told. Then Harrison appeared silently in the kitchen doorway wearing the same faded denim jacket from the night before, silver hair slightly damp from the morning fog outside. He looked toward James first. Morning. James gave a respectful nod. Coffee is ready, sir. Ethan noticed Isabel go completely still at the sound of that single word. At exactly 10 o'clock, the entire family gathered inside the library overlooking the eastern cliffs of the estate. The room smelled faintly of old leather, cedar smoke, and salt carried inland from the Atlantic wind beyond the windows. Tall bookshelves stretched toward the ceiling while dark portraits watched silently from gilded frames above the fireplace. Ethan stood near the back beside James while David paced slowly near the center table covered in financial documents. Isabel sat perfectly straight on the velvet sofa with her legs crossed elegantly, though the constant tapping of her fingernail against her teacup betrayed her nerves. Victoria remained near the fireplace wrapped in dark wool despite the warmth of the room. Harrison entered last. As always, nobody announced him, yet every conversation stopped the moment he crossed the doorway. He walked quietly toward the far corner of the library and lowered himself into an old armchair near the windows, as if the meeting had nothing to do with him. Thomas cleared his throat and opened a leather folder. The restructuring agreement is straightforward, he began carefully. Several shoreline assets will be transferred temporarily to protect the estate from further financial exposure. David looked exhausted. Deep shadows rested beneath his eyes now. Temporary, he repeated bitterly. That is the third temporary solution this year. Isabel leaned forward immediately. Because your father refused to modernize the portfolio before he died. Victoria interrupted coldly. This family survived for generations before weakness entered the equation. Ethan noticed David clench his jaw, but say nothing. That silence told him more than anger would have. Thomas continued explaining trusts, tax liabilities, investor concerns, and pending lawsuits tied to failed commercial developments in Boston. Most of it sounded like another language to Ethan, but one detail stood out immediately. Every solution depended on gaining full control over Blackthorn Estate itself. Once the property titles are consolidated, Thomas said cautiously, future authority becomes easier to manage. Harrison slowly lifted his eyes from the fire for the first time. Authority, he repeated quietly. Thomas froze for half a second before continuing. Legally speaking, of course. Ethan saw it again. Fear. Not from David. Not from Isabel. From Thomas. Sophia arrived moments later carrying additional legal files beneath her arm, dark hair damp from the morning rain outside. She looked younger than Ethan expected for someone trusted with estate litigation. "Sorry I am late," she said politely before stopping suddenly when she noticed Harrison watching her from across the room. James moved instantly to take her coat. "Miss Sophia." She nodded absently without taking her eyes off Harrison. "We have met before," she said slowly. Harrison gave the faintest smile. "A long time ago." Sophia looked unsettled now, searching his face as though trying to remember something important hidden just beyond reach. Then Thomas snapped his folder shut harder than necessary. "We should stay focused." But Ethan no longer cared about the financial meeting unfolding around him. Because for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Estate, he realized everyone in that room was pretending not to know each other. The meeting ended just before noon, but nobody left the library immediately. The storm outside had grown heavier, turning the massive windows into sheets of shifting gray while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the cliffs. Ethan remained near the bookshelves pretending to study old photographs while the others argued quietly around the central table. Isabel wanted signatures finalized before Friday. Victoria insisted delays would only weaken the family further. David looked trapped between them, exhausted by battles he no longer had the strength to fight. Harrison stayed seated near the fire the entire time, saying almost nothing. Yet every few minutes Ethan caught someone glancing toward him nervously, as though his silence mattered more than the documents spread across the table. Sophia finally closed one of the legal folders and frowned slightly. "There's a problem with the shoreline transfer records." Thomas stiffened immediately. "What kind of problem?" "The ownership structure is incomplete." She turned several pages slowly. "These properties are tied to a trust that predates the current Blackthorn holdings." Victoria's expression hardened. "Then correct the paperwork." Sophia hesitated. "It is not that simple." Ethan saw Thomas subtly shake his head at her from across the room. A warning. Sophia noticed it too. Harrison stared quietly into the fire. "Continue," he said softly. The room became still again. Sophia swallowed carefully before speaking. "The trust references a primary beneficiary whose authority appears permanent, unless voluntarily surrendered." David rubbed both hands over his face. "Who is the beneficiary?" "Nobody," answered immediately. Thomas stepped forward too quickly. "These are outdated legal complications that no longer affect current management." "That is not what the records say," Sophia replied before she could stop herself. Silence spread across the library again. Even the ticking grandfather clock near the staircase seemed louder now. Ethan looked toward Eleanor. She had gone pale beneath the warm library lights, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly. Harrison finally lifted his eyes toward Sophia. "What name is attached to the trust?" Sophia lowered her gaze to the document in her hands. Ethan noticed her voice change slightly when she answered, quieter now. "Respectful. Harrison Blackthorn." David stared at her in confusion. Isabel stopped breathing for half a second. Victoria rose slowly from her chair. "That is impossible." But Ethan understood something immediately from the look on everyone's faces. Not surprise. Recognition. Like hearing a truth they had spent years trying to bury beneath money and appearances. Harrison stood carefully from the armchair near the fire and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the storm-covered cliffs. His reflection moved faintly against the glass beneath the dark Connecticut sky. "No," he said calmly. "It is simply inconvenient." Thomas stepped forward again, voice strained now. "Those records were never supposed to resurface." Harrison turned toward him slowly. "Yet here we are." Ethan felt his pulse quicken as pieces finally started connecting inside his mind. Harrison was not an outsider living off the family. The family had been living inside his legacy all along. And judging by the fear spreading through the library, everybody except Ethan had known it for years. No one moved after Harrison spoke. Rain hammered harder against the library windows now, the sound filling the silence none of them seemed capable of breaking. Ethan looked from face to face, realizing the truth had not shocked the room because it was new. It shocked them because somebody had finally said it aloud. Victoria recovered first. She straightened slowly beside the fireplace, every movement controlled with the precision of a woman who had spent her life surviving scandals through composure alone. Those records were settled decades ago, she said coldly. You forfeited your position willingly. Harrison studied her quietly for a moment before answering. No, I forfeited my voice. There is a difference. David looked completely lost now. Somebody tell me what is happening. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly as though she had dreaded this exact moment for years. Your grandfather had 2 sons, she said softly without looking at anyone directly. Not one. Ethan turned toward her immediately. Harrison is a Blackthorn? James lowered his head slightly beside the doorway. Thomas remained frozen near the table, unable to interrupt anymore. Eleanor nodded faintly. He was the eldest. The words seemed to drain all warmth from the room. David stared at Harrison again, but this time the look in his eyes had changed completely. Not irritation, not pity, calculation. The kind people reserve for someone who suddenly becomes dangerous. Isabel slowly set her teacup down. If that is true, she said carefully, why would you spend 30 years pretending to be staff inside your own estate? Harrison gave the faintest smile. Because it is amazing what people reveal when they think you are beneath them. Nobody answered that. Ethan suddenly remembered every family dinner where Harrison sat quietly at the far end of the table while conversations stopped acknowledging him entirely. Every holiday where guests handed him empty glasses assuming he worked for the estate. Every moment Victoria referred to him as unnecessary weight attached to the family. Harrison had listened to all of it without defending himself once. Sophia opened another folder carefully. The trust structure was never dissolved, she said quietly. Legally, Harrison Blackthorn still controls the original estate holdings, including the land beneath this house. David stepped backward slowly like the floor beneath him had shifted. Then everything we built here was built on borrowed authority, Harrison finished calmly. Victoria's expression finally cracked for the first time. You disappeared, she snapped suddenly. You abandoned this family after your father died. Harrison turned toward the storm-dark windows again. No, he said softly. I was removed from it. Eleanor began trembling quietly in her chair. Ethan noticed tears gathering in her eyes as she stared toward the fire. We thought burying the truth would protect the family, she whispered. But secrets do not disappear inside houses like this. They wait. Thunder rolled across the cliffs outside. Harrison looked slowly around the library one final time, his tired eyes resting briefly on every face. And now, he said quietly, the house is done waiting. The storm finally broke just after sunset, leaving Blackthorn Estate wrapped in cold silence beneath the dark Connecticut sky. Most of the family had scattered through different wings of the mansion after the confrontation in the library, but nobody truly relaxed. The house itself felt tense now, as though the walls had absorbed decades of lies and could no longer hold them quietly. Ethan found Harrison alone in the conservatory overlooking the eastern gardens. The old glass ceiling rattled softly beneath lingering wind while dim lamps cast long shadows across rows of dying orchids and winter ivy. Harrison sat near the windows with a cup of black coffee resting untouched beside him. For several moments, Ethan simply stood there listening to the quiet hum of rainwater dripping from the roof outside. Did you know all along they hated you? Ethan finally asked. Harrison looked toward the dark gardens beyond the glass. No, he said calmly. Not at first. Ethan stepped closer. Then why stay? Harrison gave a tired smile that never fully reached his eyes. Because leaving would have been easier for them. Ethan did not fully understand the answer, but somehow it still felt true. Across the estate, voices echoed faintly from the west hallway. David and Isabel were arguing again. Their marriage had started unraveling long before the truth surfaced in the library. Ethan realized now that money had only hidden the damage more elegantly. Your father is frightened, Harrison said. Quietly. Ethan frowned slightly. He acts angry. Men raised inside old families often confuse fear with authority. Harrison finally lifted the coffee cup, though he still did not drink from it. David inherited pressure long before he inherited wealth. Ethan sat down across from him. Did you really let them believe you were nothing all these years? Harrison studied the reflection of the conservatory lights against the dark glass overhead. People become honest around those they consider powerless. It is the quickest way to learn who they truly are. Ethan thought about Victoria humiliating Harrison at dinner, about guests treating him like hired staff during holidays, About the quiet disrespect nobody ever questioned because the family allowed it to continue. You could have stopped at any time. Harrison nodded faintly. Yes. Then why now? Before Harrison could answer, footsteps approached quickly through the hallway outside the conservatory. Sophia entered carrying another stack of legal files against her chest, breathing slightly harder than before. Thomas is trying to move funds tonight, she said urgently. If he succeeds, the estate accounts could disappear before morning. Harrison remained completely calm. That calmness unsettled Ethan more than panic would have. James already locked the financial archives an hour ago, Harrison replied quietly. Sophia blinked in surprise. You knew? Harrison finally took a sip of coffee. Thomas has been stealing from this family for 23 years. Men like him always panic when secrets become public. Ethan stared at him across the dim conservatory light, finally understanding something important. Harrison had never been surviving inside Blackthorn Estate. He had been watching it patiently the entire time. Morning arrived quietly over Blackthorn Estate for the first time in years. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the cliffs washed clean beneath pale winter sunlight drifting through the tall eastern windows. Downstairs, the massive dining room sat empty except for untouched coffee cups and abandoned legal folders scattered across the long oak table from the previous evening. The house no longer felt tense. It felt exposed. Ethan walked slowly through the silent hallways until he found Harrison inside the old library overlooking the shoreline. The fire burned softly in the marble fireplace while dust drifted through beams of cold morning light stretching across the shelves. Harrison stood near the windows with both hands resting behind his back, staring toward the Atlantic beyond the cliffs. He looked older in daylight, not weaker, just tired in a way Ethan had not noticed before. Thomas left before sunrise, Ethan said quietly. Harrison nodded once. Men like him rarely stay after the truth arrives. And Isabel? Gone. Ethan hesitated before asking the question that still lingered in his mind. Did you plan all of this? Harrison smiled faintly without turning around. No, I simply stopped protecting people from the consequences of their choices. Somewhere downstairs, moving boxes scraped softly across hardwood floors. Victoria had locked herself inside the West Wing all morning while David remained in his office speaking with banks, investors, and attorneys who suddenly treated him very differently now that the real ownership of the estate had surfaced. Eleanor had not left the chapel room since dawn. Only James seemed calmer than before, moving quietly through the mansion as though a burden carried for decades had finally lifted from his shoulders. Ethan walked farther into the library, studying the old photographs lining the walls. Most showed generations of Blackthorns standing proudly beside fireplaces, horses, sailboats, and political figures. Wealth captured in silver frames. Legacy preserved carefully through appearances. Then Ethan noticed one photograph placed separately near the far bookshelf. A younger Harrison stood beside Blackthorn Estate nearly 40 years earlier, wearing a dark wool coat, while snow covered the cliffs behind him. Beside him stood Eleanor, smiling in a way Ethan had never seen before. She loved you, Ethan said softly. Harrison remained quiet for several seconds. Yes, he finally answered. But fear changes people inside families like this. Ethan looked toward him carefully. So what happens now? Harrison turned from the windows at last. The morning light caught the silver in his uncombed hair, while the old library settled quietly around them. Now the house belongs to the truth again. Ethan frowned slightly. And the family? Harrison glanced once toward the empty hallway beyond the library doors where generations of secrets had moved silently for decades beneath crystal chandeliers and polished portraits. That depends, he said calmly, on whether they know how to live without pretending anymore. Downstairs, the grandfather clock echoed through Blackthorn Estate once more. But this time, for the first time Ethan could remember, the sound no longer felt heavy. It sounded honest.